This is another edition of The Public Interest. I am Annette Ferguson. Sitting in with me today is Brigadier David Granger, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the majority in the National Assembly. On today's program, we will be discussing the human and household impact of flooding in Guyana today. Good morning, Mr. Granger, and
Morning.
welcome once again
Thank you
to the
very
Public
much,
Interest.
Janet.
Brigadier Granger, we have seen for the last decade that we continue to experience major floods in Guyana. Why does this persist?
Well, the whole world is experiencing what is known as climate change. That is no secret. In every part of the world, you can see extreme weather. Right now in North America and Britain, other parts of Europe, they're experiencing extreme weather. And we in Guyana experience extreme weather. We are subject to several changes, not only rising sea level, but also changes in weather patterns. And over the last decade or more, we've had some very serious floods. And in my lifetime, there's no flood more serious than the one that occurred in January 2005, what we call the Great Flood. There's nothing great about that. It's very notorious. There's a lot of damage. What we feel is that although the government of Guyana has embarked on something called the LCDS, a low carbon development strategy, that seems to be a financial device to get money from developed countries. But we do not see in Guyana an educational program or even a plan to deal with climate change. So every year, almost every month, some part of this country floods. But there is no remedial action by the government, by the People's Progressive Party, Civic, and there's no plan to either notify the residents or, when there is extreme weather, to alleviate the distress or to prevent the recurrence. You can't prevent rain from falling, but you could prevent homes from being damaged. You could prevent cattle from being killed, drowned in the floods and so on. So that's why we're seeing it. We're seeing it largely because it's what I call a man-made error. The government is not responding to climate change the way it should.
Okay. All right. What would be your recommendation, since the government seemingly has no plan in place to deal with flooding on an annual basis?
Well, the recommendation is to make a plan. Climate change is a permanent phenomenon. Next year there will be extreme weather. Last year there was extreme weather. And in your lifetime, the weather will become more extreme because of factors which we know. What we're recommending, looking back at what has happened over the last decade, first of all, the government should conduct an inquiry to determine causation. Nobody can claim to know all of the factors, but they must discover to what extent coastal zone management is a contributory factor. For example, we've seen photographs this week of damage to seawalls. We know there is damage to the shoreline in the Essequibo Islands and Essequibo Coast and elsewhere. There are many low-lying areas, not only in the coastline, there are low-lying areas in the hinterland and in Maruka. If you've ever been to Maruka, you'd see that it's a swampy area. Karasabai, Lethem, Kwakwani, all over the country, there are low-lying areas that are susceptible to flooding. So what we want the government to do is, on its own, conduct a serious investigation into the areas that have been susceptible to floods, to find out why these floods occur. Are they because of poor engineering, or is it because of poor planning? As we know, in November, the November flood in Georgetown, there was no warning from the hydrometeorological office. So first thing is causation. The second thing is that the government must put together a plan in order to cope with climate change. As I said, it's no point postponing it. There'll be problems next year again. So there may need to be more institutions. For example, you may need government officers who go out and inspect areas and maybe make recommendations for improvement. Bridges, roadways, seawalls, revetments, the canals, and so on. And they can pick up the danger signs. Many people assume that in Georgetown, for example, the throwing of debris and builders' waste and household garbage into canals is a contributory factor. The failure to clear the outfalls of the canals, where the canals come to the coker and where the cokers run into the river, or direct water into the river or into the ocean. So there might be lots of causes. But the government has a responsibility because it's a national problem. And the problems on the coast may not be the same as the problems in the hinterland. The problems in Georgetown may not be the same as the problems in Moruca or in Pomeroon. I know in Pomeroon for sure one of the problems is that of dredging the estuary of the river, because once the estuary is not dredged, the siltation would cause the water to be bottled up. And when heavy rain falls, the farms are flooded. Right now the farms are flooded. So there may be many causes. We're calling on the government, first of all, to conduct an inquiry. And in fact, IDB and other agencies have conducted investigations where the government has not done so. And create the institutions which are needed to protect the citizens. I, for one, after the flooding in 2011 in Lethem, I recommended that every single region should have a depot of the Civil Defense Commission, so that in the event of a catastrophe, a flood, or some other environmental hazard, the region doesn't have to wait until something comes from Georgetown. They can go to the depot. Let's say in the Burima-Waini region there's a depot at Mabaruma, and they draw stores, maybe blankets, boats, tents, water. But every region should have a depot under the regional administration, under the RDC. For example, and there should be volunteers who are trained so that in an emergency, the volunteers go, uplift the stores, and bring relief to the residents. That's how a normal country operates, but we're not operating in a normal way at all.
Okay. Outside of that, I know we're today's the 10th day of the new month, in the new year. And we know that we've already started to see, signs of rain. But since the government has failed to more or less establish a plan or devise a plan, what would be your recommendations? Do you feel that, they should more or less have something temporary in place to deal with this whole flooding situation here in Guyana?
Well, there is something temporary. I call it ad hocery. Mm-hmm. I mean, they wait until something happens and then try to blame the municipality or to blame someone else. I mean, I think the public was amused in December to hear the Minister of Home Affairs, of Agriculture, claiming that the hydromet system wasn't functioning efficiently, and the head of the presidential secretariat blaming the hydromet system. It seems as if the cabinet doesn't know what it's doing. So what I would say is that we would want to see government moving ahead on this matter. And if the government doesn't do so, it is a matter for civil society to take action to prepare the people better by giving them information on health, information on how to avoid flooding. But this was just going to be at the personal or community level. Some of the work cannot be done at that level. Some of the work has to be done at the government level. When you're talking about clearing outfalls, I don't expect the residents of Alwaisang to be able to clear outfalls. You need equipment. If there's a major sea defense breach at Mahaika, Mosquito Hall, Mahaika, there's not much that the residents could do. You can put a few sandbags and so on, but some actions require governmental involvement. And I would say that the government has to be encouraged, and if it can't be encouraged by persuasion, we have to go to the National Assembly and use the other means.
Okay. In your earlier comment, you referred to the need for an inquiry, to be done to investigate, this whole flooding situation. But we know from time to time that the government would have been called upon to establish commissions to investigate situations in our country, and we would have seen the lack or the attitude of the government not, more or less, having that done. So if the government, my question to you is, if the government is failing to establish this inquiry that you're calling for, what is it, anything that the APNU can do?
Well, in the first instance, you would be very surprised that the government does not ignore APNU. Even though APNU might call for something and the government does not accept that it should call an inquiry, the government conducts its inquiries. The government does not like to be embarrassed. The PPP does not like to be embarrassed. It does not like to be caught flat-footed. So the PPP actually responds quietly to suggestions that the APNU makes. But the danger of not having a public inquiry is that the PPP does not necessarily get the best information. They have internal departmental inquiries, and they really try to find what went wrong. But the secrecy, the opaqueness of the process, and their reluctance to admit that they are at fault have prevented remedial measures from being put in place at the correct times, in a timely manner. So I would say that the opposition cannot conduct an inquiry, but we can call on the public to provide information, and that would put the government on the spot and would force the government to implement remedial measures. For example, damage to sea defenses, damage to farms. In some cases, the government has actually quietly paid compensation. They provided fertilizers and seed material to farmers whose farms have been flooded. But this is discriminatory, sometimes prejudicial. Nobody knows for sure who gets what. But the government has been responding. The point that APNU is making, it has been responded ineffectively. They're just responding in a way to avoid embarrassment rather than to solve a major national problem. Because, as I said, every single region has been involved, and I've been to every region. I've seen floods in every single region of this country. Up to the day when we had a flood here in Georgetown in November, I was up at Anna Regina. The Anna Regina market was flooded. And I made a joke. I said, okay, if you blame Mayor Hamilton Green for the flooding in Georgetown, well, who are you going to blame for the flooding in the Anna Regina market? And most times, floods are present in several areas at the same time. It's not just one area, one flood. Sometimes there are other areas, but people in Guyana have become, I think, fed up. They become frustrated. They know there is no one to complain to. Up to this week, I received telephone calls from residents of the Pomeroon about the flooding there. So it is a continuing problem, and some people have been abandoning agriculture. They've been abandoning their homesteads. They've been abandoning farms to go in the gold field because they have to sustain their families. They have to keep their children at school. We were up at the Pomeroon, and we went to a school, a secondary school. Every springtide, the school floods. When we were there, the children had gone home for 3 weeks. Liberty Primary School. And they will flood again. When you look at the conditions there, as soon as the river comes up, that place is going to flood. I've been to Breeden Hoop, secondary school. And some springtide, that school compound floods. Parents have protested. There are photographs of parents protested. I think people are fed up with the PPP civic.
Okay. With the constant flooding in our society, more so in all the regions, we would have seen residents losing millions in livestock. The destruction to their farms. You spoke earlier about the government secretly compensating farmers, but in some cases not monetary, but giving them agricultural products, But what is your whole view on this? Do you feel that rather than the government giving agricultural products, they should more or less give monetary compensation?
No, well, I haven't been thinking about compensation at all. I've been thinking about prevention. I do believe in most cases the government could prevent some of the damage that has been done. Let us look at the East Demerara. Let's look at all of the conservancies. In fact, there are about 5 conservancies, as you know, from Essequibo to West Demerara. There's a conservancy there, East Demerara, and in Berbice in the current team. Guyana has a flat coastline, but just beyond the coastline there are low-lying areas, and there's always been an accumulation of water there. When there was sugar production or other forms of agricultural production, conservancies were created so that during droughts, water could be released from the conservancy to irrigate the farms. And of course, during rainy weather, the conservancies accumulate water. The problem is that the conservancies are generally weak, particularly the one at East Demerara Water Conservancy, because some of the revetment, some of the walls of the conservancy are made out of very unsuitable material. Bagasse, Pegasse, sorry. But these things are known, and the conservancy has a certain capacity, and when that capacity is exceeded, it will break, or the water has to be released. And when that water is released, the rivers do not have the capacity to take on the flow. The rivers overflow the banks and onto the rice fields and human settlements. So it is known. The pattern of flooding is known. In some areas, of course, there are no conservancies in Kokwani or Lethem or elsewhere. The point is that we don't have to go the way of compensation. We can do what the government is attempting to do now. This Hope Canal, even though a lot of people disagree with its structure, people feel that the canal should have been built westwards towards the Demerara River, because anything that runs into the Atlantic Ocean will be susceptible to siltation, because Guyana has a coast, and along that coast you get large deposits of silt coming largely from the Amazon, and it moves like in 30 years, a huge amounts move in like 30-year cycles. So once there is a canal or a river running into the Atlantic, and most of our rivers run into the Atlantic, sooner or later the estuary will be silted, and it has to be dredged, or the land behind it will flood. So we know these things, and it is up to the government to carry out the infrastructural work. Rather than waiting to pay compensation, do the work to make sure that the lands don't flood. But the problem is that we've had a government over the last 20 years which prefers to build a 5-star hotel, which prefers to have curry festa, prefers to indulge in a lot of cricket World Cup. I mean, these things are nice and everybody enjoys them, but in the final analysis, I think most persons would like to have good farms and good homes that don't flood, rather than just having entertainment for a few weeks in the Cricket World Cup. So I think the government has made bad choices, and as a result of those choices, it ends up paying compensation. And I was, because of my previous occupation, I was able to see an encounter between a former president and some residents of the East Coast who were complaining to him about the flooding. Every year we flood. And they asked him why he must flood. And his answer was, we know the problem, but we can't afford to fix it. So even before Cricket World Cup, even before Curry Festa, even before Marriott Hotel and all the fun and games, this man knew what the problem was, but simply did not feel that it was something that he should spend money on. And as a result of that, he was prepared to see farmers punishing every year. And as a result of that, production has faltered in some areas because the farmers just get fed up. They don't want to go through the cycle of planting, and then when they're about to reap, there's a flood. Because floods are sometimes unpredictable. And the floods in some areas have been deliberate. They are man-made disasters because the East Emerald Water Conservancy in particular has a limited capacity. And when, as I said just now, when the waters are released from the East Emerald Water Conservancy, the rivers of Barry, Mahaika, Maikoni are not big enough to take off the flow, and farms are flooded. So all that is known, it's not a secret, and the government knows that very well. The farmers know it better, because the farmers can tell the difference between water that's coming from the conservancy and ordinary river water, or even rainwater, because the conservancy water has been tinted from the vegetation. It looks like tea without the milk.
After the November 26th flood of 2013, the Insurance Association, they claimed that $150 million were being claimed from persons to cover damages. And what they're saying is that they will have to more or less look at alternatives. One such alternative is increasing premiums for flood and overflow of the sea, an increase in the deductibles in excesses for floodland overflow of the sea, and amongst others. But my question on this to you is, what are the likely effects or impacts this will have on the average persons?
Well, it will have a very serious effect on household income because, as I said, flooding seems to be a permanent condition in Guyana. And the point APNU is making is that it does not need to be. So what the Insurance Association is saying and doing, I would say, is more or less in accord with business behavior. They're in business, to make profit. They're not in business as a sort of charity organization. And they want to cover their costs. And it's a legitimate cost. If people are making claims because of damage from floodwater, well, they have to recover the money that they're paying out. So it's not a matter of whether I agree or not, but I'm saying from a policy point of view, it should not be necessary for floods in Guyana to be so frequent and to be so damaging to people's farms and homes. And this is an unfortunate consequence, but the blame must be placed at the feet of the People's Progressive Party Civic Administration, which is not taking precautionary measures. And the fact that it's happening now indicates that it's probably a decision which came about after a long period of I would say, frustration on the part of the insurance organizations as well as the public. So it is an unfortunate consequence, but we could avoid it by making sure there are fewer floods. Because, as I say, many of the floods are man-made. Many of the floods are the result of human error. They're not acts of God. They're acts of men, and lazy and incompetent men too.
I read an article carried some time ago in one of our dailies by the Guyana Human Rights Association. And what they said is that apparently the government, in their whole distribution of resources, they aren't more or less hiring the right set of people to do the proper drainage and irrigations. What they feel is that the government is more or less handing out these monies to whomever, they feel like whomever are in support of them.
I don't know that there's evidence of that. I know the government has been accused of very corrupt deals in the past, but it is difficult to come to the conclusion. I think many persons in communities are aware that the quality work is very poor. Maintenance of canals, building of roads, bridges and other structures. But that is why we have called in APNU, we've called for an inquiry into flooding, and we've called for the erection, after we get the information, we've called for the erection of institutions and structures which could carry out these works. We've called for, the establishment in the regions of some sort of flood control agencies, which could respond quickly and build structures. So we are all aware of the government's faults in infrastructure, and we are all aware that a lot of the infrastructure is weak or faulty or inadequate. But I don't have evidence to support the Guyana Human Rights Association on this matter.
Okay. A study was conducted by the Inter-American Development Bank some decade ago, and they would have showed that that's from 1988 to 2006, that 965,000 persons have been affected by flood in Guyana, and this was in excess of some US $663 million. So what is your view on this?
Well, it means that on a per capita basis, everybody in Guyana, because Guyana's population is only 750,000, so it means that some people have been affected more than once. I don't doubt those figures. The figures are probably the result of some careful study by the IDB, and the cost is also not surprising, because I've been into some places, particularly after the 2005 flood, and I've seen the effects of the damage. So I feel the figures are credible. This provides evidence, this provides information which would justify the establishment of an inquiry. Although the IDB study is useful, it is not sufficient, and we need to get more information, because, as I said, floods affect every region. I myself have been in Region 9, and I've seen floods. I've been in Region 10, and I've seen flooded areas in Kokwani. I've seen areas in Kokwani where floodwaters were about 3 meters higher than normal. I mean, they were up to people landing. So it's a very serious situation which the government is playing with. And in addition to that, one factor we haven't even considered, you mentioned the cost. One is the health, because there are many waterborne diseases which could affect the population because of flooding. So it's a very serious problem.
Okay. Brigadier Granger, critics are of the view that frequent flooding and immense damage to the country in recent years, they're saying that there should be a parliamentary standing committee on climate change and flooding. What are your views? Do you think this is reasonable?
The work of such a committee would be very useful. The only problem is that many of our parliamentarians are already involved in various committees, and I'm not sure that adding another committee to the parliamentary structure would be very helpful. Some people are on 2, 3, 4 committees. It's quite difficult to complete the work. There's no point having a committee for the sake of having a committee. But I would prefer, in the first instance, to go the way of the inquiry. A committee can monitor, but the inquiry can sit, it's more focused, you can get evidence in a limited period of time, put the evidence together, make recommendations, and have those recommendations implemented. A committee, you're talking about a year, next year, and so on. So I'm not discounting the idea, but I do feel that we need to work more quickly on this matter, and the committee will be too slow moving. I think we could have a commission of inquiry, next week, and we can have information by February. And because we're now in a rainy season, we're now in the May-June rainy season. Then we'll be coming up, and we're now in the sort of December, February, or December, January rainy season. We're coming up to the May-June season, so we have to get that inquiry going before the next rainy season, or else we get flooded again.
Okay. In 30 seconds, Brigadier, can you say to the viewing public out there, I know you have been calling for a national master plan regarding flooding. What would you like, what are some of the tenets you would like to see in this master plan in 30 seconds?
Well, first of all, the government's got to get the information. Number two, we've got to get a good hydromet office. Number three, the institutions have got to be set up. The agencies have got to be set up. And number four, we have to get a workforce that is capable of implementing the plan. I think those are some of the elements that I'd like to see.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brigadier Granger, for being on today's program. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. In studio with me was Brigadier David Arthur Granger, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the majority in the National Assembly. Do join us next week for another edition. Thank you.